This is Aucuba japonica. Welcome to another rainy session. Aucuba japonica is an evergreen shrub. The Aucubas, there are a few species of Aucuba. They're all Asian, and they're all evergreen shrubs with oppositely arranged leaves, with toothed margins. They're members of a family. It's kind of an obscure family called the Garryaceae. Gary, like the Gary oak, but named for a different Gary, Garry. Actually, it is named for the same person. I apologize. Anyway, Aucubas are dioecious shrubs, that is, separate male and female shrubs. This happens to be a female. It doesn't have a lot of fruit on it, and that's probably because it didn't get a lot of pollination this year. I can see a little bit of fruit here, which I'll point out. It's not ripe yet; it's just coming on. Anyway, the Aucuba japonica is very easily recognized in the landscape. It's typically not green, but rather it is green with yellow variegations, and we'll find you a yellow variegated Aucuba just so that you can compare. But I have to say that the green Aucubas are becoming slightly more popular these days, and the reason is probably that the yellow Aucubas look a little bit, a little bit sort of plasticky, not very real. Aucuba japonica is a shade-tolerant broadleaf evergreen. It's very easily managed. It can be pruned. It responds well to pruning, and it's very good in droughty conditions. So in dry shade, it is tough. It's in fact one of the toughest plants I know, as long as it's not planted in the sun. If it's planted in the sun, and you can see there's a sort of yellowing of the leaves here, this is because it's getting too much sun. Now, one of the easiest ways to recognize Aucuba is by the leaves, which are toothed, but they're only toothed in the distal portions of the leaf. So toward the tip, you'll find teeth and lobes, and you won't find teeth anywhere else on the leaf. As I said, these have berries, and those berries take some time to ripen. They probably won't ripen until closer to the winter solstice, or even into early spring. This is Berberis nervosa. Last week we saw Berberis aquifolium, and this is the second of three Berberis or Mahonias that are native to British Columbia. Berberis aquifolium, if you remember, we called the tall Mahonia or the tall Oregon grape, and this is Berberis nervosa, which we call the longleaf Mahonia or Oregon grape. And in fact, this has fairly long leaves compared with those of Berberis aquifolium, if you remember those. So this is a shrub. It's a rhizomatous shrub. It's not a very vigorous rhizomatous shrub. It kind of takes its time in spreading, but it's very well adapted to a shaded regime. It's native to the southwest coast of British Columbia, and so it's at home in Vancouver and tolerates whatever we can throw at it in terms of our weather. It prefers to be in a slightly shaded location, but tolerates some sun as well, as long as it has some moisture in the soil in the summer. So back to the leaves. The leaves are pinnately compound, as they are in Berberis aquifolium, but with Berberis nervosa, you'll notice that the leaflets are sessile, along the stem, and it's only the terminal leaflet that has a petiole, and that's really just an extension of the rachis. They are normally dull, shiny today because there's rain on them, but the leaves are actually dull on top, much lighter below, and they're spine margined in the same way that Berberis aquifolium are. They have a similar kind of flower and fruit arrangement as well, except that typically with Berberis nervosa, the individual racemes are much longer, and so we get racemes that are probably up to 15 or maybe even 20 centimeters long. So you have this beautiful kind of crown of yellow flowers in the spring, then followed by those same blue-black berries in the fall. So I would say this is probably one of those evergreen shrubs that's on every landscape architect's list if they're practicing in this part of the world. And that's because this is a versatile shrub that's adapted to this climate, and it's very handsome at various times, basically at all times of the year. This is Camellia japonica. The camellias are known for a couple of things. For beautiful flowers, Camellia japonica is noted for its fantastic floral displays in the spring, but it's also known as tea, Camellia sinensis, which is a different species, obviously. The new leaves are clipped off and treated to make various kinds of tea. Camellia japonica is a very tough evergreen shrub. It's a large shrub. As you can see from this is pretty typical. This is actually a Japanese cultivar. It has fancy flowers, not like you'd see in the wild, but you can't really tell that from the winter view. So what we have is we have very thick, leathery, ovate to elliptical leaves with serrated margins, finely serrated margins, and at every terminal and leaf axil in the upper part of the branch we have flower buds. And the reason that we have flower buds is that we had good warm summer weather. If the weather in the summer is too cool, then they don't set flower buds. And that's why camellias are very popular in places like Southern California, because they have nice hot summers, and that means they get lots of flower buds. Now the flowers are typically something in the neighborhood of 10 centimeters across or more, and they can be white or red or pink typically, and they often have more than the sort of regular 4 to 6 petals. They often have upwards of 20 petals, the so-called double-flowered camellias. Now, if you're interested in camellias, there's an awful lot online to satisfy that thirst. But what I should say is that given a little bit of shade, then the camellia tends to be a little bit more elegant. In the full sun, camellias tend to be very congested, very dense, and not that there's anything wrong with that, but they don't look particularly elegant. They're a little bit sort of stodgy in the landscape. And once you give it a little bit of shade, then they open up a little. The unfortunate thing is that they're going to grow fairly tall, and most people don't know how to prune them, and this can be a problem. Now, camellias will occasionally produce fruits, and they look like little apples, but they're hard and woody. They produce about 3 seeds in the fruits, but we generally don't see those fruits because most of the camellias that are grown are fancy flowered camellias, and they typically don't produce fruit. This is one of the most drought tolerant plants. This is a plant that can be grown in relatively dry shade, and that's a very, very valuable feature. Dry shade is difficult to contend with. We have a few other plants that can do that. Berberis nervosa, for example, is another plant, and Aucuba japonica. Those are all plants that do well in relatively dry shade. And so that's fairly useful for the side of a house or on the north side of a house, that kind of thing. And where there isn't irrigation, although I'm not sure I would try to establish camellia without at least a little bit of irrigation. This is Lonicera acuminata. This is one of the climbing honeysuckles. It is an evergreen honeysuckle, and so it's often just known as evergreen honeysuckle. There are actually more than just acuminata that are evergreens, but this is really the most commonly cultivated of the evergreen honeysuckles. This is a fairly robust climber, I should say, maybe even aggressive climber. And most people don't grow it the way we grow it here in the botanical garden. We just let it go up trees and let it cover the ground, and it does a beautiful job at both of those things. Nice fresh green leaves, shiny green leaves with long internodes, pointed buds, typical Lonicera with oppositely arranged leaves. The flowers are not what you'd expect. The flowers are actually very, very small, probably no more than a centimeter long, and they're kind of yellowish, and so they essentially fade into the background when they bloom in the late spring. And then they're followed by, they're actually visited by hummingbirds and bees and butterflies, if there are butterflies around. And then they're followed by blue-black berries. And those berries are taken by birds. They don't seem to be particularly invasive. We don't ever see seedlings of this anywhere around, and so that's probably a good thing. Now, most people are going to grow Lonicera acuminata on a small trellis rather than up a large tree. And for that purpose, it works very, very well. It is shade tolerant, which means that you will maintain a certain number of leaves toward the base of the plant as long as there's good light. And this is a plant that will tolerate sun or shade. It's going to flower more heavily in the sun, and it's going to produce more fruit in the sun as well. The leaf is clearly acuminate, has an acuminate tip. It's a lanceolate leaf. There's quite a bit of variation in the species. If you're looking this up and you're having trouble, you might look up Lonicera henryi. Henryi is one of the forms of Lonicera acuminata, and there may be more information in that respect. A versatile climber because it also doubles as a ground cover. It works actually very well as a ground cover. It can be clipped and kept, kept to a certain area, and it's pretty resilient in that respect. This is Nandina domestica. Nandina domestica is known as heavenly bamboo. It has some significant cultural significance in Asian countries, particularly in China. It's often grown in containers next to doorways in Asia. It's a member of the Berberidaceae. It's a little bit different than most plants in the Berberidaceae. It doesn't have any spines or thorns, and it's a shrub, which is pretty typical for Berberidaceae. And when the stems are cut, there's a kind of yellowish sap that's common to plants in that family. What's most distinctive about Nandina are the leaves. The leaves have a very, very conspicuously clasping petiole base, and they are typically tripinnately compound. So we have an axis, we have one primary axis, then a secondary axis, and then tertiary axes for the ultimate leaflets. And the leaflets are more or less lanceolate. They can be quite broad in certain places and in certain plants. Nandina domestica is pretty variable, and a number of selections have been made. There are lots of landscape selections. So, for example, we'll show you a smaller version. This is pretty typical of the species, but the cultivar called Harbor Dwarf is perhaps even more common in landscape situations. It produces its flowers in terminal panicles, that is at the tips of the branches, and those are produced in the summer, and they're followed by reddish fruits, and they're just starting to ripen right now. Interestingly, there are reports that birds do not take Nandina because they're actually poisonous. And I'm not sure that I've seen any particular scientific evidence on that. But in general, Nandina berries do kind of hang on until they're so ripe that they actually just fall off. This is Pyrrhus japonica. It's known as the Japanese Andromeda shrub. The form of this plant, it's a shrub, ultimately a tree. We typically don't see Pyrrhus grown as trees because we normally don't have that much time. But it takes about 50 years and we'll see a beautiful kind of sculptural evergreen tree. It's not unlike Enkianthus, if you remember Enkianthus. Enkianthus, of course, deciduous. Pyrrhus evergreen with these beautiful lanceolate leaves clustered above these kind of naked stems. Dimorphic branching in the way that Enkianthus also branches that way. Very strong uprights, but then once things settle down, then the branching is much more horizontal, shorter branches, and those are the branches that tend to flower more. This is a spring flowering shrub, typically in March, April, May. But we have the advantage of flower buds that are exposed over the winter. They expand over the winter. They're sort of yellow-green, and we get the contrast of those yellow-green buds against the green leaves for the winter. And then the display in the spring is often lovely. The flowers are nectar-filled and they smell of honey. When that's finished, the capsules, it has a little woody capsule that is like a little globe, a little tiny globe, but we generally don't notice the fruits. So Pyrrhus japonica is a shrub for the woodland garden or for the shaded garden. It's not something, we see it a lot planted in full sun, and when it's planted in full sun, it tends to be attacked by insects. One in particular called the Andromeda lacebug makes a mess out of plants, and that's because those plants are stressed. And so the combination of big plantings of a single cultivar plus being out in the sun, that usually is what makes them susceptible to the Andromeda lacebug. And you don't want to see the damage. We can show you the damage that is created. Usually very, very clean shrubs growing to 4 or 5 meters, more given time, and very, very variable with respect to leaf size. You can see right here, there are two different Pyrrhus japonica here. This with broader, larger leaves, a little bit more of a lax habit. This a little bit tighter and more upright. This is a cultivar called Purity, which has small clusters of flowers. This Dorothy Wyckoff has very, very long flower clusters. I'm not concerned about you knowing cultivar names at this point, just that Pyrrhus japonica produces flower buds in the winter that open in the spring, and once the flowers start to open, the new growth, the new vegetative growth starts, and that is typically coppery colored, sometimes pinkish, and then fading to a kind of brown and then green. So terrific 4-season shrub, but it needs to have a cool root run, and it needs very well drained soil and summer irrigation. This is Rubus rolfii. It's a cultivar of Rubus rolfii known as Formosan carpet. This is the third and last rubus that we'll be looking at in the course, and this is a ground covering bramble. So we call it the Taiwan bramble or the Formosan bramble or something like that. It actually has a very wide range. It grows from the Philippines north into Taiwan, and I think it might even get into China. The leaves are very, very distinctive. I'm just going to pull up a leaf here. The leaves are very distinctive. They have what I would call a bullate or even a bullulate surface. That is a very, very kind of puckered surface. If you know the fabric seersucker, it's like a fine seersucker. Lots of little bumps on the surface, and we'll get a good shot of that. 5-lobed, 3 to 5 lobed leaves. The lobes are rounded. The back of the leaf, very, very white. The habit of the plant, more or less horizontal, but layering. So it's going to build itself up into a nice kind of springy mattress. And I would lie on this, but I might get in trouble. It's a very, very nice springy mattress. It does have prickles, and those prickles, if you look at the stems, you can see the prickles. They're not very abundant, but they're sharp, but they're tiny, and so they're not going to hurt you. They're just going to stick to your clothes, and so typical bramble, typical rubus with alternately arranged leaves, but you'll notice that these have roots at every node. So these are rooting along the ground. The flowers look like a little blackberry flower. The fruits are like little raspberries. They're like little golden raspberries. Very much, in fact, like what a salmonberry looks like. And they're delicious, but they're not generally not very abundant. Nice red stems. The winter color of this, once it starts to get cold, then the leaves darken and they go a kind of a plum purple if they're in the open like this. In the shade, they tend to stay green. We don't want to grow this plant in a cold climate. It's just not going to survive. But in Vancouver, we can grow it every 10 or 15 years. We get a cold enough winter that it damages the leaves, but then it springs right back in the spring. So typically we'd call this a zone 7 plant. So last week we saw Sarcococa hookeriana humulus group. This week we're looking at Sarcococa confusa. Sarcococa confusa is not known in the wild, and so it is a garden origin plant. but nobody's quite sure, in fact, where it comes from. It is assumed that it is a cross between Sarcococca hookeriana and another species that looks a little bit like this, but nobody's been able to reproduce that cross, and so hence the name Confusa, the confused sweet box. So this is a very, very useful shrub for us. It's another in a long line of plants that we've been talking about today that are good in dry shade. Dry shade, you might not think that dry shade is very common, but in Vancouver, dry shade is actually very common. In areas like, beside buildings and under trees, particularly under coniferous trees, it can be very dry. And so these are very useful shrubs to have. And Sarcococca confusa is very shade tolerant. It produces these sort of willowy branches, very strongly upright in the beginning, and then in the second year, branches form in the axils of the leaves, and then they sort of spread out, and then again about a third time. And so by the time, pardon me, by the time you get about a 4-year-old stem, it's very well branched, but it's starting to look a little bit bedraggled, and it's probably time to remove it. On the other hand, the older branches is where you get most of the flowers. So this is producing flowers, and I can see flower buds being produced in the axils, just in the same way that you'd have flowers in Sarcococca hookeriana. But this is a much taller plant, and it's a little later to bloom. So it's not going to bloom at the solstice or in January. It's typically going to bloom in February or March. The other reason that it's confused is that it produces berries that start out red and then they turn black. And so when people first saw this plant and they saw the red berries, they assumed that it was another species, Sarcococca ruscifolia, which has red fruits and looks sort of similar. And that is indeed one of the potential parents of this plant. Anyway, unlike Sarcococca hookeriana, this has alternately arranged leaves, although we do get some close to sub-opposite leaves on some of the branches. Very, very green stems, as I say, sort of willowy looking, and lanceolate or narrowly ovate leaves. Looks great in the landscape and smells incredibly strong, which means you want to have a little bit of space around it so you can appreciate that smell. When these are in bloom in the garden, we can smell them from some 50 meters away, and the smell sort of wafts through the garden. Very, very pleasant to have flowering in February and March, or January, February, and March if you include Sarcococca hookeriana. Okay, we're looking at Skimmia japonica. Skimmia is a Japanese plant by and large. I think it might also get into Korea and China, but primarily Japanese. And this is another dioecious shrub. It's a kind of a floppy shrub, very, very flexible. If it reminds you in any way of Choicea tornata in the way that it's the stems flop, that's not a coincidence. This is also a member of the same family, the Rutaceae, the citrus family. And in fact, I can smell, you can't because you're on the other side of the camera, I can smell the glands that are producing that rue smell. Now, this is a little bit, has a kind of a strange vinyl scent. So when you walk into a dollar store or into maybe Canadian Tire and you open the door and you smell, you get that overwhelming smell of plastic containers, that sort of Rubbermaid smell. Some people call this the Canadian Tire plant because it smells so strongly of vinyl. Um, that's really a kind of an overstatement. It doesn't smell that strong, but in any case, it's an interesting way to remember this plant. It's not at all like Choicea in that it doesn't have compound leaves. It has simple leaves, and these simple leaves are oblanceolate or oblong, typically very, very shiny green and clustered toward the tips of the branches. So these are this year's leaves, last year's, the year before, and the year before that. So we have 5 years of retained leaves on these, and that's why they look as full as they do. This is a good evergreen shrub for the shade. It will tolerate some drought, but it will not tolerate, and this is again very much like Choicea tornata, it will not tolerate dry soil plus poor air circulation, because what that does is that is really attractive to mites, and mites will feed on the leaves and turn everything a kind of a dull gray green, and it looks pretty disgusting. This is a male that I'm standing next to. The male produces a kind of conical inflorescence, and that is going to, those flowers are going to open in March or April, and they smell deliciously of lemon blossom. Very, very attractive scent. The female flowers are more rounded, and they have a similar scent, but they're not as prolific. And so the on female plants, we'll just get a few clusters of red berries. The males are actually more common in nurseries because people like the smell, and so with the male plants you get a lot of flowers. Female plants, you get a few berries, and so people are often disappointed in that. This is Viburnum davidii. Viburnum davidii is named for Armand David, who was a Catholic priest sent to China to convert people to Christianity. He ended up, I think, not being such a great preacher, but he was a very, very good botanist, and he's very well known for his collections in China. If you remember Clematis armandii, same guy, Armand David. And so, of course, he's most famous for being the first European to spot the giant panda. In any case, this is Viburnum davidii is native to southwestern China. It's very, very popular shrub in this part of the world. It's a very, very hard-working shrub. You can see that it's growing about 2 meters, 1.5 to 2 meters tall, and it's a fairly large, wide bush. This is typically the way it grows. It's going to maybe even grow to 3 meters if it was allowed and it had a little bit of shade. In the landscape, it's typically people allow it to grow to 1 meter or maybe 1.5 meters, and then they chop it down, and then it comes back, and it's kind of versatile from that point of view. Although, because the leaves are so large, when it's cut, it's sort of indiscriminately, it can look pretty ugly. And for that reason, it's often maligned. That is, a lot of landscape architects and designers don't like it because they feel that it's the wrong plant. It's often, people try and squeeze it into a small area, and it's quite a big, bold plant, and it doesn't really want to be squeezed. So the leaves are immediately recognizable by their triple-nerved pattern of veins, nice big long elliptic leaves or oblong leaves, pointed terminal flower buds. These are going to produce creamy white flowers in small corymbs, and if there was a second seedling of Viburnum davidii around, that is a pollinizer, then we'd get the beautiful china blue fruits. that it produces. They're little kind of ellipsoid fruits, and they're really stunning, but we often don't see the fruits because people grow a single clone, that is a single seedling, and so that's a bit of a problem in the landscape if you want to see the fruits. As I said, it's a pretty versatile shrub. This will tolerate Vancouver conditions. A little bit of irrigation in the summer is all it needs, and like I say, it will tolerate pretty heavy pruning and respond well. But it really does need space. We would grow it in the way that we would grow a rhododendron rather than the way we grow a spirea.